Okay, well, thank you very much for everyone for joining us this evening for this talk about how the season of 2025 went at Cemlyn this year. And I'm very pleased to be able to say that I'm joined by Nick Richards, who's one of our wardens this year, and we'll be doing a bit of a double act between us. Nick will be sort of stepping in and giving a bit more information about certain parts of the year and certain species and some of the events that happened and some of the interesting facts. So yeah, but just to introduce myself, in case you don't know me, my name's Chris Wynne, and I'm the Senior Reserve Manager for the North Wales Wildlife Trust. So I oversee our 35 nature reserves, um, and um, and uh, and Bryn Ifan, which is one of our other big land holdings. So we have a team of 6 members of staff, plus the seasonal wardens at Cemlyn and other seasonal posts, and of course a massive team of volunteers who support all of our staff and do a tremendous amount of work throughout the year. Okay, so yep, here we go. Oops, sorry. Let's, Forgive me, I'm trying to do about 3 things at once here. So yeah, right, here we go. So yeah, and just quickly, there's a couple more people waiting. Just quickly, tell you a little bit about the wildlife trusts and who we are. So there's 47 wildlife trusts across the UK. Um, and at the moment in North Wales, we have over 10,000 members, and we've been consistently one of the best growing trusts in the UK and the most stable as well in terms of our membership, which is fantastic. And that, is the foundation of all the work that we can do and provides with a tremendous amount of support. Um, as I mentioned earlier, at the moment we have about 800 volunteers across the board doing all sorts of work. And our volunteers also include the trustees who manage the trust ultimately. And there are 11 of those. And at the moment, we have just over 70 staff who do everything from managing sites like Cemlyn through to managing and providing advice on invasive species, and of course, managing our wider nature reserves as well. As I said, we've got 36 nature reserves if you include Bryn Ifan, and that amounts to just under 1,000 hectares. We also have an ecological consultancy it's called Envis as well, and they provide advice to developers across North Wales and beyond. Okay, so just provide a little bit of context to our work at Cemlyn. So at the moment, our strategy is all geared to 30 by 30, which you may have heard of, which is trying to get 30% of land in the UK managed for wildlife by 2030. And to do that, we've recognised that there are a number of goals that we want to achieve. And looking at goal 3 first, nature-based solutions. So that's how nature can help us manage the environment and help us as people in terms of what we do. So how we can prevent flooding, how we can provide clean air and water for people. And the other goal is meaningful action. So that's doing things that actually will make a difference. And that's where advocacy comes in and people volunteering. And then the key one, as far as Cemlyn is concerned, as far as my job is concerned, is getting nature in recovery. So that's the work we do on our nature reserves and trying to restore habitats for wildlife and provide places for species to exist. I thought I'd sort of maybe sort of go on to this question, which often gets asked, is how we manage to fund all the work we do, but in particular how we fund the work on our nature reserves. And at the moment at Cemlyn, we're very, very lucky that we've got a very important and significant private legacy that sort of provides a key amount of the um, the funding for the site, but that is supported by a range of other things as well. Um, so lots of the survey and monitoring work we've been doing at Cemlyn and the role that volunteers have been playing in helping in that has been supported by the National Lottery Heritage Fund, which was really important to us this year. But the Isle of Anglesey Local Nature Partnership has also funded us in the past. and Natural Resources Wales are also helping us to employ staff this year as well. But of course, what we shouldn't forget is sort of volunteers on site, also in the background as well, where they're helping us, helping to manage the trust. And just in case anyone didn't know, this is our 35 nature reserves, and that one up there on the north coast of Anglesey is Cemlyn. I'm sure many of you will have been there to see the terns, but just in case anybody hasn't and is wondering where we're talking about. So right up there on the north coast of Anglesey. So just to get on to talking about Cemlyn then. So one of the single most important species at Cemlyn is the sandwich tern. And we'll come on to talk about how well this species has done at Cemlyn this year and how it fits into the bigger picture of terns around the whole of the UK a bit later on. But Cemlyn isn't just about the sandwich terns, and this is one of the really important things that we have to try and manage. The lagoon itself at Cemlyn is also important, and there's a whole range of species that like the very special conditions that get created by the inflow of tide and the inflow of fresh water into the lagoon that create brackish conditions. Some of them aren't very big, like this particular snail is only about 3 millimeters, but it's a very rare snail and very well adapted to those particular conditions, where the salinity goes up and down, and it's really important that we try and maintain those conditions even when the terns are present on site. And the other thing is at Cemlyn, we have a range of other species that are just as important. And over the last sort of 10 years or so, we've seen an increasing presence of otters, and they are sort of do seem to be present for most of the year around Cemlyn now. But then one of the other things we have to consider is that Cemlyn doesn't sit in isolation. It sort of sits on the coast of Anglesey, where not only is there a coastal footpath and an area of outstanding natural beauty, or national landscape as they're now called, but there are also developments that are happening or possibly happening along the Anglesey coast, and we'll come on to talk a bit about those a bit later on. So I'm sure some of you will have met Nick this year, but also his co-warden Zach, who were on site this year and did a tremendous job and spoke to many hundreds of people through the summer. And this year, I think it was one of our busiest years for many years. We had around about 6,000 visitors. Was it, Nick? You can just nod. Yes, 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 yeah, spot on, yeah, yeah. And so with the coastal footpath, not only was it people just who casually come across Cemlyn while on the coastal footpath, but people who were just coming to see the birds and see some of the specialities, and roseate terns and Mediterranean gull were just a couple of the species that people were really coming to see. So Cemlyn tern colony, quite a spectacle. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Nick, who will tell us a little bit about some of the key species, and I'm going to sort of be pushing the buttons as we move through the next few slides. So yeah, Nick, over to you.
Thank you very much, Chris. So yeah, so I'll just give you a bit of an overview of the birds that kind of call Cemlyn home throughout the summer, kind of making themselves part of the colony, breeding on the islands themselves, and hopefully giving a bit of a ID help, because some of them are quite tricky to tell apart if you're not too experienced. So I think on to next slide there. So these are black-headed gulls, which aren't terns, but still breed on the islands with the terns themselves. They're not a problem at all. They're actually very important that black-headed gulls do nest with these sandwich terns. Black-headed gulls are a very aggressive species, much more so compared to the sandwich tern. So lots of kind of threats and predators, especially kind of the avian ones. The black-headed gull is usually the first to kind of rocket up to them, start mobbing them, calling at them to get them away. So there's a really nice balance between the two species there. And the kind of the sandwich tern just provide those sheer numbers within the colony. So they both kind of benefit from nesting together really nicely. Yeah, top right, we have the sandwich tern. So kind of the most populous tern we get here at Cemlyn, which makes it really important. They're the largest tern we have breeding at Cemlyn, so that's one of the best ways to tell them apart, is kind of their big size. All these terns have kind of, I like to think of them as just more sleeker looking seagulls. So kind of that general kind of white and grey patterning, but kind of that nice kind of long pointed head, long pointed beak, kind of pointed wingtips, kind kind of making them much more kind of sleek in the air. Sandwich tern themselves have long black legs, but we can see in the picture kind of a long black bill with that yellow tip at the end, which is kind of one of the best ways to tell them apart. And they have kind of a silvery grey wash on the top, kind of top of the wings, which gives them kind of a bit of contrast between the top and the bottom of the birds, which helps discern them from the terns, which I'll talk about next. So there's the Arctic tern. A bit smaller. So the common Arctic and roseate, the other terns, quite similar to each other, kind of quite different to the sandwich tern. But the main things to look at is kind of the bill and the legs. So the Arctic tern here, so a bit smaller than the sandwich tern, and the legs and bill are generally kind of a darker, more uniform, kind of dark blood red color. Arctic terns especially have very short, stubby legs, especially when you see them kind of standing on the rocks on the side. You can barely see their legs sometimes. They're just like really, really short and squat. They have kind of much darker tops to the top of their wings. So especially when they're kind of flying in, you can really see kind of contrast between the dark top of the wings and the brighter body below. The bill, kind of, again, all kind of quite monochrome in color, all that kind of dark blood red color. And the tip can be darker, but it's quite a nice gradient between that dark red into that darker black of the bill. So comparing that to the common, this is generally the two species which people confuse up the most. And it's very easy to see why. They do look very, very similar. But a few points between the differences. So the common, so the one in the middle that's standing there in the picture, a bit longer legs, and the bill and legs are generally a brighter color, a bit more of a kind of brighter orange compared to a darker red. So long, bright orange legs. The bill is generally long, brighter, and that black tip at the end is much more contrasting. There's not much of a gradient. It's much more obvious, kind of brighter base to the bill and then darker tip to the end. Another thing to look out for, bit more kind of tricky to see sometimes, and kind of depending on lighting and the angle. The common has like a much kind of whiter face, and then a very nice kind of slow gradient into the kind of grey in the chest. Whereas the Arctic, that grey in the chest kind of comes all the way up to the bottom of the face and then leaves a very thin kind of white eyeliner strip. But again, this is quite hard to tell the difference, and there's a few other subtle changes on like the wings and the tails like that, but just a few points to try and help discern from those ones. And then we have the roseate terns, so the big exciting bird for Cemlyn, especially this year. Again, looks very similar to the common Arctic, but the main differences, so roseate, again, a bit smaller than the sandwich, so similar size to the common Arctic, but very, very pale. It's one of those things where pictures can't quite show it. It's when you see them in person, they're kind of almost bright white, a really lovely color. So very bright white, kind of top to their wings and below the body, so not much contrast at all. And another bit is the bill. So roseate terns generally have an all black bill, but in the summer they start to develop a red base too, so very close to the face there's like a thin strip of red. And if they're currently breeding, so a breeding pair, then that red is much more pronounced. So it can extend quarter, third, sometimes even a half in some individuals. So bill and legs and general color is the main way to tell the difference. But it took me a good few weeks of looking at them 4 to 5 hours a day to get my eye in. So they are very hard species. But yeah, that's a bit of a general overview of the birds that breed here at Cemlyn regularly.
Right. Thank you, Nick. Yep. So yeah, as Nick sort of indicated there, even as a visitor, you do get fantastic views of the birds because they fly over your head and they sit on the islands, they sit on the ridge. You do get plenty of opportunity to sort of compare and contrast the different species, particularly by the time you get to June. You know, and you get fabulous views like this roseate tern just flying over the ridge there. So really sort of great place to watch terns. One that easily the best place in Wales to watch terns. So so just to place Cemlyn in a bit of context. So Cemlyn is one of 3 tern colonies, or 4 tern colonies now actually, on Anglesey. So you've the other really big one is the Skerries, an island off to the northwest of Cemlyn, which is a big Arctic tern colony. There's another tern colony down near Rosniger as well. And there's, for the last 3 years, there's been a small sandwich tern colony in the inland sea, alongside some other sort of small numbers of breeding Arctic terns as well. But the establishment of the sandwich tern colony in the inland sea is really good news. So literally, we don't have all our eggs in one basket anymore. So that is really good to see, and hopefully in future years the numbers will just build up on that. Yeah, so just back to Cemlyn, and yeah, so like we were saying, it's quite a sight, and this year with very good numbers. So there were quite a lot of birds to see, and it's not just what you can see; it's the noise and also the smell. So it's a full sensory experience when you do go out to visit Cemlyn. So this year's wardens I think we're in about the 44th year of having wardens, and every year the terns have been counted. And this is the sort of graph that we get from the data that the wardens have collected. You can see, so there's this general increase starting off in the early 80s, when numbers were quite low. There was evidence of sandwich terns going back to the 60s, but very, very low numbers. You just get into double figures really. But as you can see here, so right here over on the right, you can see this year, whoops, sorry, go back. So that's 2025. We had 2,400 breeding pairs of sandwich terns, which is just a little bit short of the peak, which was here. That's 2,600 or thereabouts pairs of sandwich terns. So that's an awful lot of birds. That's just pairs. So that's nearly 5,000 sandwich terns on their own. So that's an amazing number. So these two funny little stars over on this side just give you an idea. So this is the average of the last 5 years, and this is the average across all years. So you can see the average of the last 5 years is considerably higher than the number that the average across all years. But one of the things to notice in this little graph is how the population goes up and down, and it sort of reflects the natural fluctuations you'd see in any animal population as they respond to climate and other environmental variables, and in particular things like predation and issues that might be affecting them off site. So things like bird flu as well. So numbers have gone up and down, and we'll talk about some of the issues that sort of have perhaps given rise to this variation as we go through the rest of the presentation. But as we said, Cemlyn is a very big sandwich tern colony, and it's and that's the most significant thing for the terns. And so in a year like 2025, they can hold up to 20% of the UK population of breeding sandwich terns. The other big colonies are so there's 20%, and that places it in the top 4 or 5 sandwich tern colonies in the whole of the British Isles. So the other really big colonies are over on the east coast, so in Anglesey, it's not Anglesey, sorry, East Anglia, places like Scolthead, which hold a few more thousand terns than Cemlyn. This is quite an interesting graph, if not a little bit confusing. It's very bright and jolly, but obviously from our point of view, what we're really concerned about is how terns are doing in the Irish Sea. So the strong black line here is the population of sandwich terns in the Irish Sea, and again it reflects that sort of up and down in response to how the individual colonies are doing each year. And you can see there's about a dozen different colonies around the Irish Sea, and all these fluctuations going in here, which is very confusing to pick out. But some of these places you might have heard of, places like Hodbarrow in Cumbria, which is a really well-known tern site, and then if you've got places like Collingford Loch and Ladies Island Lake in the southeast of the Republic of Ireland. If we get rid of everybody else and we're just left with Cemlyn, you can see how the way the Cemlyn population has fluctuated is actually reflected in the whole of the Irish Sea population as well. So Cemlyn does play a very big and important role in the Irish Sea population, and we'll go on a bit later on to talk about how we are aware of the movements between the different colonies and how we know that. So as Nick was saying, there aren't just sandwich terns at Cemlyn. We also have Arctic and common terns. So the blue diamonds are numbers of Arctic terns, and the orange squares are the numbers of common terns. And again, you get that same variation from year to year. One thing that is noticeable is if you go back to the 90s, numbers were a little bit higher. They've now returned to those numbers, but for a period of sort of 20 years or so, numbers of common and Arctic terns at Cemlyn were quite low. And some years you can see they sort of dropped down to, well, this is sort of a 20 or 30 pairs of Arctic terns and about double that of common terns. But for many years they were quite low. But in terms of the population of Arctic and common terns on Anglesey as a whole, they were doing reasonably well. The skerries and Esveidrig were holding considerably larger numbers of Arctic and common terns. The skerries itself holds about 3,000 pairs of Arctic terns, for example. So still doing really well on Anglesey as a whole, if not doing particularly well at Cemlyn. The reason for this decline was back in the sort of early 90s. There was a series of bad years, with bad weather, disturbance from birds of prey, and the population sort of dropped, and they never really came back until you get to 2020, when I'm sure everyone remembers it was COVID and lockdown and the pandemic. And one of the impacts of that for terns was that the skerries, which, as I've said, was a really important tern colony, wasn't wardened or visited as often as it was. And what happened was a pair of peregrines established themselves, and terns, being very fickle, didn't like the fact there were a pair of peregrines flying around. And it seems like most of them, particularly the Arctic terns, came to Cemlyn. So for 1 year, we had 750 pairs of Arctic terns nesting at Cemlyn, and we reckon it was about 250 pairs of common terns. These all arrived partway through the season, so it was very difficult to get a very accurate figure. But these are the numbers that we were talking about. Since then, the skerries has recovered, which is great, but our numbers have been a little bit higher than what they were for the preceding 2 decades. So we're still seeing the impact of that. So it's really great, but it gives you a good indication of how the terns can move around and the importance of having this suite of sites that the terns can move around, which generally speaking has been lost. If you look back at historical records, there were a dozen or more different sites for terns around Anglesey, and the birds sort of moved between these sites from year to year. So to talk about all the big numbers, onto the roseate terns, and I'll hand back to Nick now to tell you a little bit about the roseate terns at Cemlyn in 2025.
Yeah, so as I'm sure many of you are aware, the roseate terns were one of the big excitements for Cemlyn this season. We had at least 19 different individuals visit the colony, and we can tell this number just from looking at combinations of rings on their legs, how they behave around the colony, if they're paired up or not, how much kind of, as I mentioned, the red varies, how much red is present on the bill, what stage of kind of molting they're at with the feathers. There's plenty of different ways to identify individual roseate terns, but we confirmed at least 19, but we think it could have been up to kind of 25 or even 30, but there's just no way of knowing for sure. So yeah, roseate terns are a really exciting part of Cemlyn, and this year, especially as it's the first confirmed breeding pairs at Cemlyn since 1994, whole 31 years ago. So it's very exciting to see them return again, really. Most years, recently, we'd have them visit, 1 or 2 would visit, maybe for a few days, but again, show no signs of interest in terms of breeding and settling down, and they'd leave rather quickly. But this year we had 2 pairs. First one came in, instantly settled down, which was really exciting, and then later on a second pair came. Sadly, both these pairs did fail. We don't know for sure why, but they both settled down and attempted to breed, which is incredibly exciting and very promising for the future of roseates here. In the UK, last year, so 2024 population was about 120 pairs, but it has been higher in the past as they are recovering from bird flu. Ireland, though, has about 1,700 pairs, with kind of their main stronghold being Rockabill off the coast of Ireland there. The roseates were one of the main reasons we had such a kind of exceptionally busy year. We expect around 2/3, maybe just over 2/3 of the people who came to visit Cemlyn this year came just to see the roseate terns. So it's an incredibly exciting thing to happen this year. We had people coming from all over the UK just to come and see these roseate terns because it's such an accessible place for the public to come and see them, which is really exciting. Another exciting part are little terns. So little terns don't actually breed at Cemlyn, but they do at Gronant. So that's further over to the east, like northeast Wales is our nearest colony here. And again, we'd usually get one, maybe two records a year, and they come in, rest on the island, just because they're amongst other terns, they feel safer like that. Wouldn't show any signs of breeding, but would just come visit for a few hours the evening, maybe a few days at most. But this year we had 5 records, which is really exciting. So we were not too sure why. There's a much bigger number than recent years. And from talking to other little tern colonies, especially over in Ireland, it was seeing that they were having a very mixed year. So their colonies were seeing few birds return, very mixed kind of productivity and success. So just not very good year for them. So lots of tern movement, little tern movement was happening in the Irish Sea. So that's why we were seeing so many little terns turn up at Cemlyn this year. So looking kind of at such an important site, it does come with several issues. So one of the kind of methods we use to help these are electric fences. So being an island is very safe from plenty of predators, but being within the lagoon is still quite accessible. So as Chris mentioned earlier, there are kind of otters present, especially throughout the winter. We see plenty of kind of sprints and tracks, things like that. And they have been a problem in the past, but since we've got an electric fence installed, the otters still stick around in the winter, but as soon as the spring comes around and we install the fence and the terns return, they see like the attack activity really drops off from them. We can't find any sprints really more, any tracks, so they seem to move away, which is really handy because they are a protected species themselves. The fence also helps from other predators, so herons can be a problem because they don't just eat fish, they can eat chicks as well, but the fence helps deter from that. And even not as a predation, but just trampling. So geese, kind of large flocks of geese regularly use the lagoon for roosting. So in the evening, you can have kind of 20, 30 geese coming in to roost. And if that fence wasn't there, they'd likely come onto the island and they could very easily trample the eggs, which are very fragile. So this fence, again, just helps from that as well. Herring gulls as well can be an issue. So the fence isn't that much of a kind of prevention from them because they are very smart. But the terns themselves can be very good deterrents. So as I mentioned earlier, the black-headed gulls are very aggressive, along with the Arctic terns as well. They're a very aggressive tern species. So any herring gulls that do get too close, those birds are kind of straight up mobbing them, calling at them, and that usually kind of deters them away, which is very good. One of the other issues that some people might not think about too much is people themselves and visitors. So plenty of people come to see the birds, but as they are such a sensitive species, kind of wrong practices, and people might not realize how easy it is to disturb the birds. So it's not just about predation, kind of the taking of eggs or chicks. Just disturbance itself can be really damaging. So especially when it's a very sensitive period, when the terns are kind of pairing up, settling down onto nests, people being too close, or even kind of dogs being off lead, not even attacking or chasing the birds, but just being very visible as a threat does scare the birds a lot. And repeated disturbances, kind of dreads, as you see all these terns kind of fly up into the air, kind of big swarms of them almost. Repeats of these can be really damaging, and if they think it's just not safe enough to nest, then they might just abandon the colony. So it's very important to kind of stay behind the rope, make sure you're a safe distance away to view the terns as well.
Thanks, Dick. Thanks for that good summary of some of the issues facing Cemlyn. I think it's really important, that the work of Nick and Zach and all the other wardens we've had at Cemlyn on site, sort of helping to provide the terns with the best chance they get, or they can possibly get. There are so few tern colonies in the UK now. It's really important that each one has the best chance it can possibly get. And it's just through the work of all our site wardens across the UK, all our tern wardens, that enable us to have good results that we're having, and to protect the seabird population. So just to go back and have quickly just look at this graph, as Nick was saying, the various things affect the population, and the numbers do vary from year to year. Sometimes we don't have any control, and it takes us a while to respond to what the threats are. But you might be sort of wondering, well, how can we know all these numbers? How do we know what's going on? So one of the most important things we do is basically Nick and Zach lying on a beach all summer long counting terns. So that's a really important job, and provides us with really good information about how the birds are doing, and also how the season progresses. So it gives that first indication of how the year might be going. So numbers build up from around about sort of early April through into sort of May and into June, and then you start seeing birds sitting on eggs, and then you see the young, and then you see the young fledge. So those observations are really important. But we back that up and we support those sorts of observations with a direct clutch count. So all this work is done on the license from Natural Resources Wales because of the protected species present, and we do it with a whole protocol in place. That means we get out there and do the work as quickly as possible. And some of you may have been involved, and some of you may have seen us doing it, but what this gives us is some really detailed information about the population and the number of eggs. And so that is the basis of all the work that we do. So when we talk about sort of 2,400 pairs of sandwich terns, that is based on a count of that many nests in that particular year for sandwich terns and the other species. And Nick mentioned earlier on that we know the roseate terns bred, and we know that for definite because we actually found their nest and we saw the two eggs in there and were able to identify them as roseate tern eggs. So we know that for a fact that they tried to breed, and that's why we're so really pleased that roseate terns have bred. Okay, they weren't successful, but fingers crossed for future years that they will come back and breed again. With all this data, we can also have a better look at how the colony is doing. So although the number of breeding pairs tells us a lot about how well the colony is doing, it's not the only bit of information that can be revealing. So another one is the average clutch size per nest. So that's what this little graph shows us, and you can see that there is some variation again, and clutch size can vary for all sorts of reasons. And it does fluctuate from year to year depending on the size of the colony. Interestingly, work on sort of seabird colonies around the world, including terns, has shown that as a colony expands, sometimes the mean clutch size can decrease. So they almost become less efficient at producing young as the colony gets bigger and bigger. And that's just due to competitions for space, competition between the birds, and that sort of chicks can die, get trampled on, get killed by other terns. So all sorts of things happen as the colony expands, alongside disease as well, and not just sort of things like bird flu as well. But so this gives us an interesting and useful comparison between years. And you can see here there's a nice picture up here of a juvenile sandwich tern, which just adds to the extra things to be aware of in birds flying around by the time we get to June. And Nick talked us through the different adult birds, but by the time you get to June and late June and July, you are starting to see juveniles. And this is a sort of classic sort of sandwich tern. You see this lovely sort of grey-brown pattern on the back and this sort of grey head there. So really distinctive by the time they get around to flying. One of the other things you can look at is how many fledged birds each nest produces. So at Cemlyn, this is a little bit more difficult because we have to rely on observations of the island from the ridge. So as you can see, there's no real pattern in this graph, and there are so many variables at play here. It's very difficult to pull out any sort of real trends. There's a lot of biases in the data, so it's very difficult. On some seabird colonies, you can get very accurate information about productivity, but at Cemlyn it's a little bit more difficult, which is unfortunate. But we do get sort of anecdotal information as well about how many fledged birds there are seen. So you can see, we do seem to have reasonably good years for the last few years, and so these birds are reaching the flight stage and flying off, and then being seen around the coast of Anglesey and North Wales for the remainder of the summer. So the next thing is back to Nick, who's just going to talk about one of the major differences at Cemlyn in 2025.
Yeah, thank you. So lots of the visitors, if you did come, especially in kind of the first half of the season, so kind of late spring, early summer, lots of people noticed that there just wasn't much vegetation at all. And this was a combination. So last year was particularly wet summer and spring, so kind of really encouraged vegetation growth. And over the winter, there's the most recent winter, we think there was kind of lots of flooding. So we allow the lagoon to become tidal over the winter. So we think a lot more kind of high tides and storms kind of submerge the islands for more than usual, which kind of harmed and delayed vegetation growth there. And then, as I'm sure you're all aware, we had kind of the driest spring on record and one of the hottest summers on record, which again kind of inhibited that growth of vegetation. So both these photos were taken on the same day, but a year apart. And it's a bit hard to see exactly, but it's quite visible that there are very big differences in vegetation. So 2024 kind of big clumps, particularly of sea beet, but other kind of marine plants there. But 2025, those patches of vegetation just aren't there. And this is really important for the sandwich terns and black-headed gulls, as they like to nest amongst that vegetation. It just makes them feel safer and kind of as a group together, much happier to nest together. So you can kind of see that in the picture from this year, 2025, that most of the birds are settled around those kind of few clumps of foliage there. And in that back right-hand corner, this is a big kind of flat patch of grass, but very few thick bushes. And the birds just decided not to nest there. And before our clutch count, we were seeing maybe only 1,000 pairs or so of sandwich terns. We were thinking it could be a really low productivity year. So we were a bit worried about that at first, but then once we did the clutch count, we actually had more than a really good year, so over 2,400 pairs, which was double what we could see from the ridge, which just shows how important doing a clutch count is. If you're basing the values simply from the ridge, the figures would be completely different. But it's all these different factors that play into where the birds nest, how densely they nest together, how many you can see from the ridge, and all these kind of productivity figures can really kind of fluctuate with all these different variables. And then in the late summer, once you kind of had a bit of rain, all that foliage is kind of really bushed up. And once you're trying to see all the chicks, so you can work out the productivity, how successful all those chicks were, it's really hard to see them because all those bushes and grass is just in the way. You can only really see them once they've come out into the big kind of dusty gaps where it's just the sand, or right outside the island, which again means your figures are kind of really different sometimes. So one of kind of the important bits we do throughout the season are feeding surveys and looking at what the terns are eating. So it's kind of the classic picture all the photographers want to get at Cemlyn is the sandwich tern with kind of a beak full of sand eels. So this is their preferred food, sand eels, a bit like kind of the other seabirds, particularly puffins, kind of big beakfuls of sand eels. They also kind of like other small fish, so sprat, herring. Occasionally we've seen common and Arctic terns collecting crabs from the lagoon itself. And on one of the feeding surveys, I even saw a tern come in with a young squid. So they can have kind of a variety of food there. As Chris mentioned earlier, like generally they feed around the coastline. So if you're walking around the coast path or just on any of the beaches, you might have seen sandwich terns just around the coastline feeding. And their way of catching fish is kind of hovering or kind of circling high in the air, and then they dive just below the surface. So that's where most of their fish are, is just below the surface of the water. So kind of dive up high, catch the fish, and then bring them back to the colony. So most of the fish, or all the fish we record, we record it relative to the size of the bill. So it's quite hard to have a standard measurement of so many centimeters when you're looking at pictures or looking at the bird through binoculars. So lots of the feeding surveys we do is how big the fish is compared to the bill. So kind of one time, so it's the same size as the bill, two times kind of bigger fish, twice the size of the bill, things like that. And we can see patterns throughout the season. So at the beginning of the season, when the birds are pairing up, one of the methods for pairing up is that one of the pair will go catch the biggest fish they can find, bring it back for the female, and kind of present it to them. You might see kind of like they're sticking their wings out, kind of strutting around each other. Male presents the fish as a saying, like, this is how good I can hunt. I'll be kind of reliable catching fish. I can raise kind of young very well, things like that. It's kind of a nice big fish there to try and show off how good you can hunt. And then as you come the season, once the young are starting to hatch, then you'll see the general fish size is much smaller because the chicks are so small. They need those smaller fish at that age. And then as the chicks get older and older over several weeks, you'll see the average fish size again kind of get bigger and bigger as the chicks get bigger. And surveying every single year allows us to see how sand eel and other fish stocks are doing. So if what we saw this year was vast majority of the fish, or sorry, of the prey caught in were sand eels. So there seemed to be a plentiful amount of sand eels out there. But others, you might see lots of sprat or herring or completely different fish. So you can kind of work out how well fish stocks are and how well that might be kind of impacting the chicks, how quickly they're growing up, if there's enough food for them. So it's a very good factor to study throughout the season and year on year. One of the exciting sites you might see out at Cemlyn is kleptoparasitism. So klepto, stealing, and parasitism kind of taking from, like, feeding off one another. So these terns will go out to catch their fish, come back. But the easy way to catch fish is just pick it from someone else who's already done all the work for you, which isn't very nice, but it's much easier. So it's the best method, really. So sometimes you'll have skewers, so great skewers, Arctic skewers, far out at sea, kind of harassing the terns out there. But once they come back to the colony, maybe the black-headed gulls might have a go for them as well. So sometimes you'll see 1, 2, 5, I've seen up to 10 black-headed gulls just chasing sandwich terns, and it's got an absolutely huge fish, looks like a really big dangly mustache, and just a dozen black-headed gulls chasing after them. But it's a very exciting sight, but it's not an issue at all for the terns. Like, it's not damaging them at all. It's a very low probability. Oh, you're muted, Chris.
It's all right. I've only been doing this for about 5 years, so yeah, I'll get used to it soon. Yeah, sorry. So yeah, so Nick just referred to the way that the terns all go off and feed around the coast of Anglesey, and following some work done sort of in the early 21st century, that was one of the reasons that the Special Protection Area, which is the international designation that protects the tern colonies on Anglesey, was actually extended to include some of their feeding areas. So it's really important that terns are able to feed around the whole of the coast, and it sort of highlights the fact that you can't just have a nature reserve there on its own. You have to think about the whole of the environment, the whole of the coastal system. So this little graph just gives an indication of where the terns go from Cemlyn when they're feeding. The fatter the line, the more terns are heading in that particular direction. But it also perhaps gives us the opportunity to think about where sandwich terns occur around the whole of the world, really. As you can see from this map of the world, there are relatively few breeding colonies, particularly in Northwest Europe, where we're particularly concerned about. But there's also some over on the coast of eastern coast of America, and then some further sort of east in the sort of Middle East area here. All terns do migrate and head south for the winter, and sandwich terns in particular sort of head down the west coast of Africa. So and even around the coast of South Africa. Whoops. And how do we know this? And that is down to ringing and flagging. So I'm sure you're familiar with your standard sort of little BTO silver ring, which is this one you can see here on this sandwich tern chick. And although these are great, you can only really find out about where this bird's been or how old it was or where it was ringed once you get hold of this ring, and that is often when the bird's died. So now another way of identifying individual birds is using these flags. So that these are very lightweight, and someone has sort of compared this to us wearing a ring on our hand. That's how light these rings are and flags, and they're very, very important. And one of the good things about these flags is that you can see this with a good telescope, as long as they're not standing in, belly deep in grass. You do get to see this, and once you can see that, you're able to identify the individual bird. So these orange flags are Cemlyn, and we've been putting these flags on birds since 2019. We've missed a few years, things like COVID and bird flu. So we've done it 3 times now, and so we're building up a big cohort of juveniles that we have ringed. And as a result of this, we are able to find out where the birds are when they gather. Just a quick question, Nick. I think you can you see all the names of the different parts of that pie chart there?
Only some of them, only the
Right.
right-hand side of the names
Yeah,
there.
I'm not quite sure what's happened there because there are lots more there. But anyway, okay, I'll see if I can remember where they all are. So this is a collection of, it says here, 207 sightings of 142 different birds that were seen around the North Wales coast in 2024. So this is towards the end of the summer when the birds start to move around a lot. So this big patch here is Cemlyn ringed and flagged birds, as you might expect. But what's interesting is these birds that come from other parts of the Irish Sea. So you've got Hodbarrow in Cumbria. So this is on the North Wales coast, don't forget. Hodbarrow in Cumbria, Ladies Island Lake in southeast Ireland. Ynys is sort of down towards mid Wales. Interestingly, these are all chicks that will have been ringed and flagged. These birds are adults that are caught and ringed and flagged. But then, although none of these names appear, that you can see there's a whole range of other birds from other locations. And this isn't just Wales and Ireland, it includes Scotland. There's a few birds that have been seen that have come from the Netherlands. And interestingly as well, birds from the eastern coast of Great Britain. So these birds are flying vast distances to come to North Wales before they all head much further south as we get into the sort of late summer and into the autumn. And we have been lucky enough to get some reports of birds elsewhere, and in particular this one, AJL. So this was seen in Gansabi in South Africa. And this was I think this was a 2023 juvenile that by the time it got to sort of, I think it was October, it was in South Africa. And here you can see it with a whole load of other birds sort of roosting. So you can see that is some incredible journey. So about 5,000 kilometers or more. So an amazing trip for such a very young bird. More recently, we've had reports of birds that have overwintered on the west coast of France, and in particular a place called Sebastopol Polder. This is a man-made wetland, and as you can see there, that picture sort of on the left-hand side, again a big seabird colony there. So there was 2 of our birds were reported there in 2024 after being ringed in 2022. So it provides a lot of useful information about how these birds are moving around. But it also makes us think about how far these birds fly. And an adult sandwich tern that maybe can live for 25 years or so could end up flying to the moon and halfway back during its lifetime. And that is an incredible amount of flying, and just really sort of makes you think. It's a hell of a lot of traveling. Okay, so just to come back now and just think a bit more about some of the issues that we're facing at Cemlyn, and Nick sort of referred to some of the direct ones that are actually directly affecting the terns themselves, but there are some other bigger issues as well, and one of the most significant is some of the influences of climate change. And particularly if you look at this aerial photograph, you can see that the lagoon and the islands do look very fragile. And if you've been at Cemlyn at high tide, it doesn't feel like much between the sea and the lagoon. And some of the storms that Nick was referring to earlier that may have been partly responsible for the low vegetation this year are sort of changing the ridge every year. Some studies that have been done by the National Trust looking at the way the ridge is changing and moving does show that it does move every year. And if you come to Cemlyn in the winter and then you go back in the summer, you can see that dynamic environment. And it's that dynamic environment that makes it so interesting for the plants. They have to respond and adapt to these conditions. But we do sort of perhaps slightly nervous every winter with a storm and wonder what's going to happen at Cemlyn and what might happen to the ridge. One of the other things that keeps us on our toes is all the developments in the marine environment. There are various proposals around the Anglesey coast, and perhaps we've also got one eye on the future at Wilver and proposals for a new generation of nuclear reactors and what that might mean for potential impacts on Cemlyn. With the previous proposal going back to about 5 or 8 years now, there were some big concerns about the potential impact on Cemlyn, and a lot of work was done to try and mitigate for those. And of course, there is one very big factor that has affected seabird colonies around Britain for the last few years, and that is bird flu. And thankfully, in 2025, we had no problems whatsoever at Cemlyn with bird flu, and we didn't have any in 2024. So now we've had sort of 2 good years after some quite bad news in 2023 and a big effect on the tern colony. But thankfully, we're able to avoid situations like this picture on the bottom right with our wardens dressed up trying to deal with all the dead birds. But it's important to realise the bird flu hasn't gone away, as you can see from this map, which I took from the Animal and Plant Health Agency website a few days ago. There are still various records of bird flu around the UK, and you get an idea of sort of the range of species if you look at this pie chart. It's quite interesting. You can have a look at this website yourself and have a fiddle to see where things are happening and what birds are being affected. Relatively little in North Wales this year, thankfully. All these pie charts here are quite small, so there were very few records, which is great to see really and to hear about. So finally, just head back to Nick, who's going to talk a bit more about some of the other wildlife that we get at Cemlyn, because apparently there are other things other than terns there.
Yes, there's amazing variety of wildlife. So there's obviously the lagoon with the islands, but you're right on the coast, so you got great kind of rock pooling. There's some nice kind of scrub and farmland around, lots of kind of flooded fields, wetland sites there. So there's an amazing variety of habitats, which holds a huge variety of wildlife. And this year we managed to record a total of 807 different species of wildlife, which is an amazing figure. So that's 135 birds. So apart from the terns, we do daily bird censuses. So we'd walk around the site recording every bird we saw and heard, any breeding activity, and then kind of following them throughout the season, repeating it every day. You know kind of how successful those breeding birds were, any migrants passing through. So it's really good just to seeing a general bird life separate to the terns. Plenty of butterflies as well. So whenever the weather is good, which luckily this year was quite often, we do butterfly transects. So again, kind of walking around the site and recording all the butterflies we'd seen. Again, with kind of long-term data sets, we were able to see how those change throughout the years, depending on kind of weather, kind of population change. So it's really good to do that. 194 moths. So whenever we had a good night, we'd put out moth traps. So a box with a light, and the moths are attracted to the light, get caught in the box, and then in the morning, a bit like Christmas, you can come outside, open a big box, and it's just full of moths, which is just amazing. But we managed to record over 3,000 individual moths, with 19 of their species being new to Cemlyn, which is really, really exciting. So constantly new species being recorded at Cemlyn, which is really nice. Almost 200 plants, so all kind of roadside verges, kind of meadows, kind of right on the coast, and the picture there with the yellow flower, the yellowhorn poppy. So we've got some really lovely specialist plants that love the kind of the dynamic landscape of that large shingle ridge. And then lots of other wildlife as well. So in the bottom left, there's a candy striped flatworm, so plenty of rock pooling, kind of insects, fungi. So there's a huge variety of other wildlife that we record whilst we're there all summer. But yes, so Cemlyn is one of the most important tern colonies in the British Isles, but it's also really important, as I mentioned before, for just plenty of other species of bird as well. So one of them being medgulls, which look quite similar to black-headed gulls, but actually have a black head, which is very confusing because black-headed gulls have a dark chocolate brown head compared to an actually black head of a Mediterranean gull. So we usually get about 1 to 3 breeding pairs at Cemlyn each year. This year we had 2 attempt to breed. Sadly, they both failed, but it's really nice just to see their presence here almost every year. Also in the sites, in kind of late summer, as you start to see the terns start to kind of thin out as they all start to fledge and leave the colony. Birds like little egrets kind of start to take their place. So birds heading south on their migration, kind of moving through the country, see the lagoon and the surrounding habitats as really important kind of resting stops on their migration. So sometimes in late summer you get kind of dozens and dozens of little egrets just surrounding the entire lagoon, which is really lovely, nice, lovely sights to see. Also ring plover, really lovely kind of coastal bird, which nests sometimes on the ridge itself. So where you view that terns on that shingle ridge, sometimes just over the edge, so maybe only a few meters away, you have ring plovers, sometimes oyster catchers as well, nesting on those shingle there. And a very important site for them, as so much of the surrounding coastline is so busy with people, dog walkers, things like that, having that edge of the ridge line, which is kind of protected by the rope and like the wardens, making sure it's undisturbed, can be really important for those ground nesting birds such as ring plover.
Great. Thank you, Nick. So that was a really sort of quick look at some of the many other species that you see at Cemlyn. And I think, you know, finishing on that final picture there of a ring plover, I think ring plover are a really good success story at Cemlyn. For a couple of decades, we weren't getting ring plover nesting on the ridge at all. And it's in the last sort of 2 or 3 years that we've started to see a couple of pairs attempting to nest and getting away with young, which is fantastic. And I think that's down to, you know, the work of the wardens and the volunteers and the help that they provide in just managing people. And I see there's a nice question in the chat about that, so maybe we'll come back to that in a few minutes. But yeah, so just sort of to round up now, and just to finish off before we do go on to the questions, I'm sure many of you are members, so thank you very much for your support. And you probably might get our e-newsletter, which is a great way to find out little snippets of news in advance of our newsletter. But also, if anyone is interested in helping out, maybe we are going to have a sort of a short day at Cemlyn on the 24th of October, where we'll be doing a sort of a range of things. We might make some further nest boxes for the terns. We'll have a look, see what winter birds around, like this turnstone, and we'll also have a look out for some otter sprain. So if you would like to join us, do come along. I can't promise that we'll get such a tremendous array of cakes, which we got for one of our volunteer sessions right at the beginning of the season, and you know, so should really thank Llanon Mill and the cafe there. One of our volunteers brought them along, and that was fantastic, and a really big treat. And they were amazing cakes. So I can't promise we'll get them, but there might be some biscuits anyway. So yeah, so do come along if you like, even if it's just for an hour or so, just to see what we're doing and have a chat. But there's lots of ways to find out about Cemlyn, and I'll put a few of these links in the chat as we finish. And our website, there's a We've got this lovely infographic, and if you click on the various buttons, you can find out a little bit more about the terns. But we also have this Discover Terns at Cemlyn, which is like a diary through the year. And now we have, I think it's 3 or 4 years worth of diaries, so you can see how the year progresses and get the excitement of the roseate terns breeding, the roseate tern chicks, and all that, all those stories. So that's all still there on our website. And also, if you're interested in the history of the site, if you have a look at some of our blogs, Cemlyn celebrated its 50th birthday a couple of years ago, and we produced a series of blogs about the history of the site, which includes things about sort of development of the weir, but also about Captain Hewitt, who built and owns Bryn Abbas, which is at the west end of the ridge. Fascinating story there, and there's a little bit about him on the webpage, our web pages as well. So yeah, so that's the end of our presentation, and like I said, we've got one question in the chat, and I shall put a few of the links in. But if anyone would like to ask a question, please drop it into the chat. Yeah, so Nick, just while I drop a few things in the chat, what do you think about that? Can you see the question?
Yes, yeah, I
Yeah.
can see it there.
What do you think about that one then?
Yeah, it's a very good point. Dogs are one of the main issues we have at Cemlyn. So plenty of visitors come to walk their dogs there and come to kind of bring their dogs to come and see the terns, which in of itself is not bad at all. But good dog practice is so important at the site. As I mentioned earlier, people saying, like, "Oh, my dogs won't go after the terns." It's not just the predation of kind of attacking the terns or anything like that. The disturbance of terns, scaring the terns, is such like can be such a danger to the colony and the birds themselves. With repeated disturbances, can mean they just abandon the colony for that year. And it's not just kind of the terns themselves. As I mentioned earlier, there's the ring plovers, oyster catchers that might nest on the ridge. Just going over the rope mean you might just trample an egg or a nest or disturb the birds there. And there's plenty of other birds that use the ridge and the lagoon for just yeah, roosting, resting, feeding, anything like that. So it's a very good point. Kind of trying to minimize dog disturbance as much as we can.
Yeah, I think you're really spot on there, Nick. It's a big issue, and I think the ward spend a lot of time trying to deal with it on site, and maybe banning dogs is the answer. And I think while we're in the sort of the close season, so to speak, there's plenty of conversations we'll be having with all sorts of people about how we could go about doing that and how it might work. And as part of doing that, I think you would have to talk to people and and see what people felt about it and how we could do it. But I think the key thing to remember, with so few tern colonies like Cemlyn around, we have to try and give them the best chance that they possibly can. And that might involve trying to manage dogs even more than we do at the moment, one way or the other. And I think the other part of the question, is about just generally the increase in visitors. And I think, at Cemlyn, you can see that not only in terms of the numbers of people visiting to look at the terns, but also just in the car parks. And it seems to have been increasing almost since lockdown and the pandemic. Now we're at a situation where almost every weekend is really busy, and what we previously would have thought of as a bank holiday level of traffic just happens every weekend now, and bank holidays are just completely chaotic. And just isn't the space for people or in the car park in particular. So we do have to think about how we can manage this, and and everyone has to play their part. I think that's a really important thing to think about. It's not just about what we might be doing in managing people, but everyone has to be aware of the role that they can play as individuals as well. I'll just scroll down. I think there's a few. Is the lagoon natural? Shall I answer that one?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, go
Yeah.
ahead.
So the basically the answer to that is yes. So what was there prior to the weir was a salt marsh. So if you think of places like um, Lligwy, where there's a very similar sort of situation where you've got a tidal salt marsh. So it looked like that for many, many years since the ridge was created. And it was Captain Hewitt who first put the original weir in place. And if I can scroll back to this picture, that's the original weir there. So you can see it's holding back water behind it. So that, in effect, what that did was it meant there was standing water in the lagoon almost all the time. So the islands that we can now see are what's left of the original salt marsh. So you can still see the creeks that you often get on salt marsh that run between the different parts of it, particularly on the main larger island. So it is natural in origin, but it's now heavily modified by the fact that the weir is present. Yeah. So there was a question. Oops. Did the closure of Wilver improve things for the tern population? That's a very difficult question to answer. I don't think it had a significant effect actually on the tern population at Cemlyn. One of the perhaps the most obvious things is I think they've been going through a process of demolition of some of the buildings, and in effect what this has done is removed gull roosting sites, and those gulls are now, or were for a couple of years, more visible around the sort of the whole of the countryside around Cemlyn. So I don't think there's any obvious direct effects of the closure of Wilver. Next question, and thank you very much for that. The question in Welsh as well. Visit without a car. You can get a bus to Tregello, or you can cycle there. It depends. So it is. It's not the easiest place in the world to get to, but it is possible if you're prepared to walk from the A5025 at Tregello. Yeah. So the next question was about how much influence we may have about any future consultations. So I think that they are starting that process now. So there's some survey work going on, and we will be involved in the consultation. So we played a very important part alongside the National Trust and the RSPB in the public inquiry to the previous proposal for a nuclear power station. And so we hope we can influence the detail of what might happen. And yeah, but that requires significant resources, which we are looking at how we might be able to provide those. So yeah, I think we did have quite an influence on how the inspector at the public inquiry viewed the biodiversity information that was provided in that public inquiry, which was now a few years ago. Okay, question about the seals. So we don't actually directly monitor the seal population at Cemlyn. There's other organisations do monitor the seal population around Anglesey, but we don't directly monitor it at Cemlyn. That's a good question. One thing I was just going to ask you, Nick, one thing that we touched on was how big the population is, and we talked about the breeding population and the adults and the young. But are there non-breeding birds terns at Cemlyn as well? And is it possible to see them?
Yeah. So yeah, kind of this year we had about 2,400 pairs of sandwich terns. That's how many that are breeding here. But you'd get quite a few non-breeders. So non-breeding can involve pairs that attempted to breed but failed, maybe from predation or whatever reason they weren't successful. They might still hang around in the area and then maybe head off earlier than other birds, but they'll probably hang around for a while. And then also kind of younger birds. So it takes a few years for them to reach sexual maturity, so for them to be able to pair up and breed. But they'll usually kind of come back to the spot they were born at. So you get lots of kind of generations in the same colony. So they'll come back to that same colony, try and kind of practice. They might practice pairing up. So they might try kind of catch fish and displaying to potential partners.